The police cruiser hadn't even stopped rolling before the HOA president started smiling. She folded her arms, looked directly at my wife, and loudly announced for everyone on the street to hear, "I told you they don't make exceptions." Several neighbors stepped onto their front lawns to watch. Kids stopped riding their bikes. Even the landscaping crew shut off their leaf blowers. Apparently, this wasn't the first time Karen had called the police on someone she didn't like, but it would be the last. Because 5 minutes later, after one police officer quietly looked at my wife's federal credentials, his entire attitude changed. He straightened his uniform, stepped away from Karen, lowered his voice, and politely asked my wife, "Ma'am, would you mind speaking with me over here?" Karen's confident smile disappeared instantly. She had expected us to be escorted out of the neighborhood. Instead, she watched the officers apologize to us, and before the afternoon was over, the HOA board would be holding an emergency meeting. Not because of anything we had done, because of what Karen had just admitted doing in front of multiple witnesses. My name is Ethan Brooks. My wife, Rachel, has worked for the federal government for nearly 12 years. No, she's not famous. She doesn't travel with bodyguards. She doesn't wear a badge around her neck. In fact, if you met her at the grocery store, you'd probably assume she was an elementary school teacher. She dresses casually, drinks too much coffee, volunteers at the animal shelter every other Saturday, and laughs at terrible dad jokes even when they aren't funny. Most people have no idea what she does for a living. That's exactly how she prefers it. When friends ask about her job, she usually smiles and says, "I work in regulatory compliance." Technically, that's true. The details stay at work, and they stay private. Our move to Maple Grove Estates was supposed to be simple. After years of saving, we finally found a quiet neighborhood close to my office and within walking distance of a great elementary school. The streets were lined with old oak trees. Families walked their dogs every evening. Children played basketball in driveways. It looked peaceful. The seller accepted our offer. The inspection went smoothly. Closing day arrived without problems. We officially became homeowners. Or so we thought. Our moving truck pulled into the neighborhood at exactly 9 o'clock Saturday morning. Friends helped unload furniture. Rachel organized boxes inside. I assembled beds before the movers left. Everything was going perfectly, until a white SUV stopped in front of our house. A woman stepped out wearing expensive sunglasses and carrying a leather folder. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't welcome us. She didn't even say hello. Instead, her first sentence was, "Who approved this moving truck?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" This community requires advance HOA approval for commercial vehicles. It's a moving truck. I know what it is. It's unloading our furniture. She opened her folder. Rule 8.4. I smiled politely. We closed on the house yesterday. That's irrelevant. We own the house. You still need approval. Rachel quietly walked onto the porch. Is there a problem? The woman looked at her. Are you the homeowner? We both are. I'm Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. Rachel nodded. Nice to meet you. Karen ignored the greeting. You'll need to stop unloading immediately. I honestly thought she was joking. We've rented this truck by the hour. Not my problem. Our movers are already inside. They'll have to leave. Rachel remained calm. We weren't informed of any approval requirement during closing. Karen shrugged. That's your responsibility. I'd be happy to review the documents. Karen smiled. There won't be anything to review. Rachel looked at me, then back at Karen. I'd still like to see the rule. Karen handed us a printed copy of the HOA handbook. Rachel carefully read the section, then looked up. This says commercial parking restrictions don't apply during real estate closings. Karen reached for the handbook. You have an older version. I thought this was current. It isn't. Could you email us the updated one? Karen didn't answer. Instead, she took out her phone. I've dealt with enough difficult homeowners. She pressed several buttons. I'm calling the police. I laughed. Because we're moving into our own house? You refused to comply. We asked to read the rule. You argued. Rachel quietly touched my arm. Let's just keep unloading. Karen heard her. I told you to stop. Rachel smiled politely. We're not blocking traffic. We're not damaging property. We're simply moving into our home. Karen looked furious. You people think the rules don't apply to you. About 10 minutes later, the first patrol car arrived. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out. A second officer followed. Karen hurried toward them before they even reached us. They're refusing lawful HOA orders. They're violating community regulations. They're trespassing. Officer Ruiz looked confused. They're trespassing on the house they just bought? Karen nodded confidently. Exactly. The officer slowly looked at us. Do you own the property? I handed him the closing documents. He reviewed them carefully. They appear to be the legal owners, Karen interrupted, but they violated HOA rules. Officer Ruiz calmly asked, Is this a criminal matter? Karen hesitated. It's an HOA matter. He nodded. So this is a civil dispute. Karen's confidence slipped slightly. Rachel stepped forward. We're happy to cooperate. She reached into her purse. I also have identification. She handed Officer Ruiz her driver's license. Behind it, almost by accident, a second credential briefly became visible. The officer's eyes immediately narrowed. He looked at the credential, then at Rachel, then back at the credential again. Without saying another word, he quietly handed her driver's license back, but not before asking, Ma'am, may I speak with you privately for just a moment? Rachel nodded. Of course. The two of them walked several feet away. Karen folded her arms and smiled. Good. They're finally figuring out what's going on. She had absolutely no idea that the conversation happening 20 feet away was about to change everything. Because the moment Officer Ruiz recognized the federal identification, he realized Karen had unknowingly made accusations against someone whose government position required specific legal protections and official reporting procedures. And within the next 30 minutes, the HOA president would discover that calling the police wasn't the biggest mistake she had made that day. Officer Daniel Ruiz walked with Rachel to the edge of our driveway, far enough away that the conversation remained private, but still within sight of everyone gathered outside. Karen stood with her arms folded, watching confidently. She clearly believed the officers were about to remove us from the property. Instead, Officer Ruiz quietly asked, Ma'am, I noticed your federal credential. Rachel nodded. Yes. I won't ask about your position. Thank you. I only need to confirm whether there's anything about today's situation that requires special handling. Rachel answered calmly. No. I'm here strictly as a private citizen and homeowner. Understood. She slipped the credential back into her purse. Nothing dramatic happened. No flashing badges, no phone calls to Washington, no secret agents arriving, just a respectful conversation between a police officer and someone whose federal identification he recognized. The officer thanked her and returned with me to the driveway. Karen walked over immediately. So? Officer Ruiz answered professionally. This appears to be a civil HOA disagreement. Karen frowned. I told you they're violating the rules. Do you have documentation showing they are committing a criminal offense? No. Then there's nothing for law enforcement to enforce. Karen's voice grew louder. So you're refusing to remove them? They're the recorded owners of this property. Several neighbors quietly exchanged glances. Karen wasn't finished. She pointed toward Rachel. She's lying about something. Officer Ruiz looked surprised. What do you mean? Nobody keeps two IDs unless they're hiding something. Rachel remained completely calm. My identification is valid. Karen stepped closer. I want to know who you really are. Officer Ruiz immediately raised one hand. Ma'am, please step back. For a moment, Karen actually looked offended that the officer had corrected her instead of us. She turned toward the growing crowd. You all saw this. Something isn't right. At that exact moment, one of the neighbors quietly approached me. He introduced himself as Tom Harrison. I've lived across the street for 15 years. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry your first day here turned into this. Thank you. He lowered his voice. Karen does this a lot. What do you mean? If someone disagrees with her, he shrugged. She calls code enforcement, parking enforcement, the police, the HOA attorney, anyone she thinks might pressure people. Another neighbor joined the conversation, then another. Within minutes, 6 residents had gathered nearby. Every one of them shared a similar story. One family received repeated violation notices because their holiday decorations stayed up 2 days too long. Another homeowner was fined over the shade of brown used on a backyard fence no one could even see from the street. An elderly couple had been threatened with legal action because Karen believed their wheelchair ramp affected neighborhood appearance. Rachel listened quietly. She finally asked, "Did anyone ever challenge the board?" Tom sighed. Most people couldn't afford the legal fees. While we were talking, Officer Ruiz reviewed Karen's original complaint. He looked confused. Then he asked her another question. "Ma'am, when you called dispatch?" "Yes." "You reported trespassers?" Karen nodded confidently. They were. Officer Ruiz held up the closing documents I had already shown him. "But you now know they own the property." Karen crossed her arms. "I didn't know that then." He continued reading. "You also reported possible fraud." Karen hesitated. "I suspected fraud." "And you reported that before speaking with them?" She didn't answer. Officer Ruiz simply made another note in his report. About 20 minutes later, a black SUV entered the neighborhood. Everyone turned to look. It wasn't another police vehicle. It belonged to the HOA's attorney. Apparently, Karen had called him before dialing 911. Attorney Stephen Collins walked directly toward us carrying a briefcase. He greeted Officer Ruiz first, then introduced himself. "I'm legal counsel for Silver Creek HOA." Officer Ruiz nodded. "We've resolved the law enforcement portion." Stephen looked toward Karen. "What happened?" Karen quickly explained her version. "They refused to follow HOA rules. I called the police. They argued. They flashed government credentials." Stephen looked at Rachel. "May I see the governing documents you received at closing?" Rachel handed him the packet. He carefully reviewed every page. About 30 seconds later, his expression changed. He slowly turned toward Karen. "Where did you get the rule you quoted?" "Our updated handbook." "May I see it?" Karen proudly handed over her binder. Stephen flipped directly to the page she had referenced, then frowned. "This isn't the current handbook." Karen blinked. "What?" He turned another page. "This amendment was rejected by the membership last year." She looked confused. "No, it wasn't." "It absolutely was." He opened another folder from his briefcase. The official records show the amendment failed by 63%. Several board members who had quietly arrived during the police visit looked shocked. One whispered, "I thought it passed." Stephen shook his head. "It never became enforceable." Karen stared at the pages. For the first time all afternoon, she looked uncertain. Officer Ruiz closed his notebook. "So the rule being cited," Stephen answered before Karen could, "is not currently valid." The officer nodded. "Thank you." He finished his report. Before leaving, he handed both Rachel and me the incident number. "If anyone attempts to interfere with your lawful move today," he looked directly at Karen, "please call us." The message couldn't have been clearer. The officers shook our hands, then drove away. Karen remained standing in the middle of the street, watching the patrol cars disappear. Her original plan had completely backfired, but instead of admitting the mistake, she doubled down. That evening, every homeowner in Silver Creek Estates received an emergency email. Special HOA board meeting. Mandatory attendance requested. Word spread quickly. Neighbors wanted answers. Board members wanted explanations. The HOA's attorney wanted to know why outdated rules had been used to threaten new homeowners. When Rachel and I attended the meeting the following evening, the clubhouse was completely full. More than 100 residents filled every chair. Some stood against the walls. Others waited outside. The meeting had barely begun when one homeowner stood and asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Why were the police called on our new neighbors?" Karen reached for the microphone. But before she could answer, Attorney Stephen Collins quietly stood up. "I believe that question deserves a complete and accurate explanation." The room fell silent, because what Stephen was about to reveal would expose far more than one bad decision. It would uncover years of questionable HOA practices that many homeowners never knew existed. And by the end of the meeting, Karen would realize that the police had not been the biggest problem she created. The official records were. The clubhouse had never been this full. Every chair was occupied. People stood along the walls. Others watched through the open doors from the patio outside. Some homeowners had lived in Silver Creek Estates for over 20 years. Others, like us, had been there less than 48 hours. Everyone wanted the same answer. How had a simple moving day turned into police cars, accusations, and an emergency HOA meeting? Karen Whitmore walked confidently to the front of the room. She adjusted the microphone. "I know there has been a misunderstanding." Before she could continue, HOA attorney Stephen Collins stood. "I believe the board should hear the legal review first." Karen hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. Stephen placed 3 binders on the table. "I spent most of today reviewing the events that occurred yesterday." He looked around the room. "I also reviewed the governing documents, board minutes, violation records, and the police incident report." The room became completely silent. Stephen opened the first binder. "Let's begin with the moving truck." He held up the current HOA handbook. The rule cited by the HOA president does not exist in the current governing documents. Several homeowners immediately looked at one another. One board member quietly whispered, "I knew something felt wrong." Stephen continued. "The amendment removing moving day exemptions was proposed last year. It failed during the community vote. The official records clearly show it never became enforceable." Karen interrupted. "I believed it passed." Stephen answered calmly. "Intent does not change the official record." No one spoke. He opened the second binder. "This led me to review additional enforcement actions." The projector behind him displayed a spreadsheet. Violation notices, fine amounts, property addresses, dates, patterns quickly appeared. Many citations had been issued using outdated or rejected rules. Some homeowners had paid hundreds of dollars in fines that were never legally authorized. Gasps spread across the room. An elderly homeowner slowly stood. "I paid almost $900 over the last 3 years." Another added, "We received 3 violation letters about our wheelchair ramp." A young couple raised their hands. "We were threatened with legal action over our vegetable garden." Stephen nodded. "I found those files." He looked directly at the board. Several enforcement actions appear to have relied on provisions that were either amended, rejected, or interpreted beyond the authority granted by the governing documents. The room erupted with conversations. The board president struck the gavel repeatedly. "Order, please." After several moments, the room settled. Stephen opened the third binder. "This concerns yesterday's police response." He projected excerpts from the official incident report. The responding officers concluded that the dispute was civil in nature. The homeowners had valid proof of ownership. No criminal activity had occurred. He paused before continuing. The report also notes that the responding officers were provided with documentation confirming the homeowner's lawful ownership before the call concluded. Karen folded her arms. "So what?" Stephen looked directly at her. "The significance is that continuing to insist they were trespassing after ownership had been confirmed exposed the association to unnecessary legal risk. The room became very quiet. Then Tom Harrison, my neighbor across the street, stood up. "I'd like permission to speak." The board agreed. Tom looked around the room. "I've lived here 15 years. I've watched neighbors receive letters over things that weren't actually violations. I stayed quiet because I assumed the board knew something I didn't." He looked toward Karen. "I don't believe that anymore." One by one, more residents stood. A retired teacher, a military veteran, a young family, an elderly widow. Each shared similar experiences. Most had paid fines simply to avoid arguments. Others had spent money complying with rules that weren't actually enforceable. For nearly 2 hours, homeowners spoke. No shouting, no insults, just facts. Finally, one board member addressed Karen directly. "Did you personally verify the rules before issuing violation notices?" Karen hesitated. "I relied on my handbook." "The outdated handbook?" Silence. Another board member asked, "Did you know the amendment had failed?" "I thought," he interrupted gently. "We're asking what you knew." Karen looked down. "I was mistaken." The admission changed everything. The board recessed for 30 minutes. When they returned, the atmosphere felt completely different. The vice president stood. "After reviewing the attorney's findings, the board has reached several decisions." He read from a prepared statement. "Effective immediately, all enforcement actions based upon the invalid provisions are suspended." Applause filled the room. "Second, every questionable fine will be independently reviewed." Louder applause. "Third, homeowners who paid fines under unenforceable provisions will receive appropriate reimbursement or account credits, subject to legal review." Several residents actually stood to applaud. Then came the final announcement. Karen Whitmore has submitted her resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. The room fell silent. Karen slowly stood. She looked exhausted. "I truly believed I was protecting the neighborhood." No one interrupted. "I made mistakes." She looked around the room. "I'm sorry." Without another word, she picked up her binder and quietly walked toward the exit. No one clapped. No one cheered. People simply watched her leave. Sometimes accountability doesn't need celebration. It simply needs to happen. Over the following months, the HOA changed dramatically. A new board was elected. Meeting minutes were published online. Every proposed rule change required clear explanations and homeowner voting. Violation procedures were rewritten with guidance from independent legal counsel. The atmosphere in the neighborhood slowly changed. People actually attended community events again. Neighbors started talking to one another instead of worrying about receiving violation letters. One Saturday morning, while I was planting flowers in our front yard, Tom walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," he laughed, "your first weekend here was a lot more exciting than mine." I smiled. I was hoping for something a little quieter. Rachel joined us outside. Tom looked at her. "I never did ask. What exactly do you do for the federal government?" Rachel laughed. "I still work in regulatory compliance." Tom smiled. "Fair enough." And that was the end of the conversation, because her job had never been the point. The federal ID didn't magically solve the problem. It simply reminded the responding officer to handle the situation professionally and respectfully. The real turning point came from something much more ordinary: documents, accurate records, calm conversations, and a community willing to correct its own mistakes. About 6 months later, the neighborhood held its annual summer picnic. Families filled the park. Children chased each other across the grass. Music played from portable speakers. For the first time since moving in, Silver Creek Estates truly felt like the peaceful neighborhood we thought we'd purchased. As the sun began to set, Rachel slipped her hand into mine. "Worth all the trouble?" I looked around. Neighbors laughing together, kids riding bicycles, people introducing themselves to new families instead of questioning them. I smiled. "Yeah, I think it was." because sometimes the strongest communities aren't the ones that never make mistakes. They're the ones willing to admit them, learn from them, and choose respect over control. In the end, Karen didn't lose because someone flashed a federal ID. She lost because facts, transparency, and accountability proved stronger than assumptions. And that's a lesson every neighborhood can benefit from. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful HOA stories, neighborhood drama, justice-served endings, and unforgettable community conflicts every week. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.